Okay, hang on. Let me try to move a little something around here. Well, it's a pleasure to get together with you today to talk about some research that we've been doing over many years, and that's culminated in an interesting observation that we might make in terms of how we might progress in our understanding of animal cognition in general, and in this particular case, the pigeon as an associative machine in particular. Okay, this always happens. So you may have heard that pigeons aren't real. There's a website that you can go to discover that there's been this plot to plant pigeons or these funny machines all around the world, but they're not real. And if you go online to the website, you'll see that the pigeon is hypothesized to actually be a kind of machine-like creation involving a camera, a microphone, a speaker, a CPU, an antenna, a battery, and so forth. And the website that you can go to learn about this remarkable development is pigeons aren't real. But in point of fact, the rumor is false. Pigeons are most definitely real. They start their life looking like this, and they ultimately look like this. It's quite a dramatic transformation. Those are the faces that only mothers could love, to be clear. So why might we want to consider that pigeons are indeed machines or machine-like? Well, one step in the journey is to Project Orcon. Many of you have heard of this, but perhaps some of you haven't. This particular project is one of some fame or infamy, if you will, and it was begun by none other than B.F. Skinner in 1944 in his laboratory in Minnesota, in Minneapolis. It was nearing the end of the Second World War, and the Allies were looking for ways that they might more efficiently take out German installations, and the thought was to turn a rocket to good use, but they needed a guidance system, and they thought, well, perhaps pigeons might suffice. So you can see in this picture Skinner holding a pigeon. There would in fact be 3 of them located in the nose cone of the rocket, and they would effectively serve as the guidance system for the missile. And in choosing the pigeon, Skinner made the following observation. He said, "The pigeon is not an intelligent bird, but a practical one, and can be made into a machine from all practical points of view." This was then the source of the selection of pigeons as the brains of the missile, the guidance system for these missiles. This system was tested only in the laboratory, never put into the field. I think it was pretty obvious that if anything were to go wrong, the military would have some explaining to do, and it would have been quite embarrassing for all considered, particularly for Skinner. But there's yet another reason, a more modern reason, why we might want to consider pigeons as machines. And we're going today to consider that they might be deemed to be associative machines. And the argument goes to a paper published a dozen years ago by David Smith and Greg Ashby and company. It was entitled Implicit and Explicit Categorization, A Tale of 4 Species. And in this paper, they made a number of interesting comparisons of the behavior of pigeons and people. They suggested that unlike humans, pigeons show no sign of using strategic rules or selective attention when categorizing various stimuli. And the stimuli in question were these Gabor stimuli. They look like this. They can be varied in their tilt and in their width. the width of the stripes, how many there were, and the tilt or angle of the lines. Did I hear something? Did anyone have a question? Okay. So from these data, Smith and company proposed two categorization systems. One system they called the explicit system, the declarative system, in other words, that involved the prefrontal cortex. This was the high-level system. And a lower-level system, an implicit or procedural associative system that involved the basal ganglia. They hypothesized, the authors did then, that humans have both systems, both the explicit and the implicit, but the pigeons have only the implicit system, the basic foundational associative learning mechanism that we're more or less all familiar with. Nonetheless, the authors praised the pigeon's implicit system for its simplicity, parsimony, breadth, and power in the bird's learning to categorize a wide range of both natural and artificial stimuli. Indeed, the pigeon's unitary, non-analytic system, they said, might be especially adept at learning complex or non-linear category decision boundaries that would defeat a dimensionally aligned rule-based system. So they actually suggested that it might be the case that the pigeons could outperform humans if the tasks were such that a more high-level learning mechanism would be looking for a different way to solve the problem, when in fact only the basic implicit system would do. So what Brandon Turner and I did was to envision the pigeon's simple associative mechanism to do a simple procedure, a simple associative connection, linking limited regions of the bidimensional Gabor space to distinctive behavioral responses via error correction, a simple error correction process. So we tested this by giving the model that we developed the same tasks as we had given to pigeons to see to what extent the model did effectively capture the pigeon's behavior. And today I'm just going to focus on two of the most difficult categorization tasks that offered no advantage to learners using more advanced rules or strategies. So our tactic here was to give the pigeons tasks that high-level explicit categorization rules would fail at, but only the more basic associative mechanisms, the implicit systems, would succeed at. And these tasks we've given names. One is what is called the concentric rings task, and the other the sectioned rings task. I got rings on my mind. I'm into circles these days. And in the following slides, I'm going to show you 16 exemplary stimuli just to illustrate the structure of the two categorization tasks that the pigeons were given. And I'm going to tell you now that the pigeons actually had to categorize not 16, but hundreds of such stimuli, and the stimuli didn't repeat. They never happened again. They were trial unique. So you need to keep that in mind. Don't forget, when I show you a small subset of the stimuli, just for explanatory purposes, realize that the birds are getting hundreds of them and they're not repeating. This is also a rather important detail and an important fact to keep in mind. So here is the space that the pigeons were shown. I don't know whether you can actually see me. I don't think you can. Are you all seeing that this simply says stimulus space up here? Because my computer is covering it up with something else. So there are 16. Sorry?
Sorry for interrupting. I'm just saying that, yes, we are able to see the images.
The label, can you see the label at the top?
Yes, totally.
Okay, because I can't. Okay, so this task, for your purposes, just to introduce you to what's going on, shows these 16 stimuli. And the stimuli are arrayed, although you can't yet tell, in two circles, okay? And they're chosen strategically. And here is why. These in the inner ring belong to one category, and these in the outer ring belong to a separate category. So the pigeon is going to have to categorize stimuli into one of two categories, in this case, the red grouping and the blue grouping. We can call the red category A, the blue category B. What's important about this task is you can't simply concentrate on the orientation of the stimuli, because if you cut the space this way, you can't produce those two categories. And you can't use the frequency or width of the lines. If you cut the space this way, you again can't capture the A and the B category. So in order to learn this categorization task, you have to deploy some other mechanism. You can't use the simple cheats of looking only at the wide lines or the narrow lines or the more vertical lines or the more horizontal lines. You have to use an elaborate or more elaborate structure that incorporates both orientation and frequency. So this is going to be a difficult task, and I'll show you in the upcoming slides how difficult it really is. But having, you'll see, succeeded in teaching pigeons to learn this task, then we created one that was even tougher, one that was even more challenging, and this is the sectioned rings task. In this case, the two categories marked with red for category A, right, and blue for category B, they don't even lie on the same circles. They lie in quadrants, and they alternate. So members of one category are never adjacent to one another beyond the quadrant in which they're located. This is a beast. This is an incredibly difficult task. And if you're going to ask me, have you ever given this to people? I'm going to say no, because we don't think that people would have much luck in learning this categorization scheme. But maybe someone will volunteer. We don't know. So these are the two tasks that will be focused on, the sectioned rings task and the concentric rings task. Now, the challenges that are posed by these two tasks can be seen in the next two slides in a different way. They're going once again to depict the same 16 stimuli, that subset, just for your purposes. And on either side of the full set, which is going to be in the middle of the screen, are going to be the two categories of stimuli on the outside of the screen. The first slide is going to be the concentric rings task. The second is going to be the sectioned rings task. And you'll see how difficult it is to imagine us spontaneously generating the two categories that we have diabolically created for the purposes of the experiment. Yet, pigeons learn both of these tasks, although the sectioned rings task proved to be much more difficult. So, this is the space of that encompasses all the 16 training stimuli, and you can look at them, and if I asked you to sort them into two categories, I guarantee you there's no way spontaneously you would create category A here and category B here. You just wouldn't. You know from the prior slide that these are created from the rings, category A being those in the innermost ring, category B from the outermost ring. But there's nothing, there's no obvious perceptual glue to hold this category together and to distinguish it from this category. You might think that this is just going to be an impossibly difficult task, but I'm going to show you that pigeons do learn it. And this, well, this isn't really going to look too different to your eye. The same 16 stimuli are split into two categories once again. And again, there's nothing about these stimuli that seems to link them together. And there's nothing about these stimuli that seems to link them together. And yet, I'm going to show you that pigeons do learn to categorize them. And I'll explain how the model that we've devised succeeds. So here's the model. This is what we've all been waiting for. This is the model. There's your pigeon. On any given trial, the pigeon sees one particular Gabor patch, right? It has a certain orientation and it has a certain spatial frequency. It has a certain width of the lines and it has a certain tilt of the lines. It sees that, and that goes into the input layer of the model. The output layer of the model is going to generate two responses, category A or category B. And what's happening in the middle is the connection is going to be created between them. And it's going to work via the simple method of error correction. So let's walk through a trial. The bird sees a stimulus. Bingo, here it is in two-dimensional space, right? Orientation and frequency. That's where the stimulus resides. And the pigeon, if it makes the correct response, is going to receive reinforcement. And that's going to make it more likely that the pigeon deems this to be a member of category A, the innermost ring. So here's the stimulus, and here's its representation within the model. Not only does the response to category A go up in likelihood, but the tendency to make the response associated with category B goes down. So when reinforcement happens to the stimulus from category A, you can see the darkening of the red and the lightening of the blue. And this makes it more likely on another occasion that the bird will peck the key that's associated with response A, category A. So that's the essence of the model. It is the simplest associative network that one might envision, and it's leveraged by this representation of the stimuli in two-dimensional space. So where does learning take place? This is the pigeon's classroom. The pigeon has a touch screen. Here is where the stimulus material will appear. There's a feeder on the back wall, and you're all pretty familiar with operant conditioning methods, so this is going to be no surprise to you. How does a trial work? All right, this needs to be explained. The trial, I said, is going to start with a Gabor stimulus, but in point of fact, it starts with another stimulus just to make sure the pigeon is looking in the vicinity of the screen. After all, they do wander about. So the pigeon pecks an orienting stimulus, a start stimulus, and the next response presents the Gabor stimulus. So there it is. That's the stimulus that has to be categorized. And the bird's going to have to say, is this a member of category A or category B? Well, to make sure if the bird sees it, it might have to peck 20, 25, or 30 times, depending on the bird. And now comes the decision point. Now, what happens? We take a slightly different attack on how to teach the category task. We present that same stimulus that had appeared in the center on both the left and the right side of the screen. If it's a member of category A, pecks to the left key will deliver food. If it's a member of category B, pecks to the right key will deliver food. So this procedure involves replicating the trial stimulus on two different choice buttons, and the pigeon makes its choice accordingly. In this case, the stimulus came from category A. The bird pecks it, and when it pecks it, a white box appears, and then pecking the white box delivers food. If the bird had mistakenly pecked the right-hand key to this particular stimulus, then it wouldn't get food. It would have to go back here and restart the trial, and ultimately, through correction trials, eventually make the correct response. So that's how it works. So we use this procedure of presenting two replicas of the training stimulus. One is to be used to report category A, the other to report category B. And although this may seem a little odd to you, it works very well for the pigeons. So let's look again at the concentric rings task, and let's look at a couple trials, a couple training trials. So here again, we can present two different stimuli. Remember, they're randomly presented from category A. These happen to appear here. And after reinforcement, you see these two regions becoming darkened. That means they're more likely to pick the category A button when these stimuli appear with it, okay? All right. And less likely to make category B responses if responses similar to this stimulus appear. Remember, they never happen again. So one of the important things for you to appreciate is it's not a single dot where reinforcement strengthens the tendency to make the categorization response. It's a little kind of penumbra right around it. And that generalization is what leverages the bird's ability to learn this task in the first place. Because if stimuli never repeat, you could never get effective transfer from one stimulus to the next. Here are two trials involving reinforcement to stimuli that belong to category B. Again, those stimuli then will darken areas in the vicinity of the reinforced stimulus and lighten tendencies to make the opposite response to the other category. And the next step is to show you what it looks like in theory if you had given infinite training to all the values of the stimuli in the inner ring and all values to stimuli in the outer ring. That would be the method. This would be the neural or computer-based representation. So you can see training with category A really darkens responding to category A, but you also see that it's darkening other areas too. That's going to be important. And here's category B. You see, ultimately, you're going to have this ring pronounced in dark blue, but where category A would have been very light. And likewise here, where category B would have been is very light. So it's what it's effectively doing is strengthening the tendency to make the correct response. So the model is functioning as it should. After all, we're designing it to try to capture this. And how well did it work? How well did it work? Well, here's that representation once more. The predictions from the model are these connected points with the black line. That's what the model predicts. And this is the behavior of our pigeons. So you can see that the model is very nicely capturing the behavior of the pigeons with just some very simple assumptions about learning rate and stimulus generalization. But there's a lot more that the model predicts. And this is the really part that makes the model pop. We not only train with these two categories, category A and category B, but we give testing trials. Testing trials in the middle of the space and testing trials beyond the outer training ring. Why? Well, I did this work in Spence Laboratories of Psychology. You might have heard of peak shift. This is the prediction from associative models of the sort that Spence had envisioned in 1937, but this is sort of the 2024 version of his modeling. So what's happened? What do these bars represent? Well, the red bar represents category A, the training stimuli. They come from the responses given to stimuli here. And of course, they're in testing, there's still new ones, but they get reinforced for those responses. And this is the bird's behavior in the bars themselves, and the predictions are the little circles. You see that there's highly accurate responding. Remember, you get over 80 to 85% correct. You get really good discrimination to stimuli in category A and stimuli in category B. But hang on, you get even better responding when stimuli lie beyond the training stimuli in category B and within the ring of category A. So these points represent remarkable demonstration of the associative basis of the bird's learning. It's the result of this kind of excitatory inhibitory thing that goes on. There's generalization in this ring from the wrong category here, There's generalization in this ring from stimuli in this category, but there's much less erroneous generalization from category B here and less erroneous generalization from category A here than here. That's why you get even better discrimination performance to stimuli that were never given in training, that never even would have fallen in the training rings. You'll also notice that there is a middle section here in between the rings. It's sort of a kind of a bad place to be because you're getting generalization from both directions. But even then, they were at 60% correct. So even within this middle region, as you got to the outside here, they were saying B more than A. When you got to this region here, they were saying A more than B. But the main point is, main points are one. There are 2 points. The model captures the nature of learning in the first place and the nature of generalization to stimuli beyond the training regions themselves. This is a unique and powerful hallmark of associative learning. Well, let's go to the sectioned rings task. This one promises special problems because of the unique and peculiar character of the categories themselves. So here is what a representation of the sectioned rings task where the cuts in the rings create a plus sign. So that's a cross plus. And you can see that the prominent areas of responding to category A are in fact associated with properly those parts of the space, and those parts of the space that are associated with category B are appropriately darkened in, and where category A is strong here, it's category B is weak here, and so forth. So the learning model is capturing the rules of reinforcement. We included one more version of this task to cut the rings diagonally to create an X. We call this the X cut. And once again, it's doing the same thing. You're darkening in the areas that are associated with reinforcement, category A and category B, and lightening appropriately those regions that would be erroneous for reporting purposes. So what happens? Does the model learn this as hard as this is? And do the pigeons learn this? And the answer is yes. Is the predicted performance of the model. It gets about 65% correct. It's not outstanding. It's not nearly as good as before, but the task is much harder. And this is the performance of pigeons. And you can see that the fit's pretty good. The fit's pretty good. So they learn this task, albeit with much greater difficulty than the concentric rings task. But there's one more twist. One more twist. There are areas here within the space where there's a high likelihood of erroneous responding. As you get closer to the edges where you go from one category to the next within a ring, you shouldn't be able to do very well. You'd be more likely to be correct in areas that are distant from the points of contact with the wrong category. And to show this, we took this same area and then divided it up into what we called middle areas and boundary areas. And the idea is that accuracy should be much better in the middle areas, these areas here, than the boundary areas here. And so these middle areas should be much more accurate than the boundary areas. And when we split the bird's behavior up into those areas, we see that the predicted level of accuracy is much lower for the boundary regions than for the middle regions. And the pigeon's behavior, this other line here, this fuzzy line, matches. So there's yet another hallmark of associative learning. That's stimulus generalization. You can see that generalization is going to make it less likely that you'll do well if you're near the category boundary. So things are looking pretty promising by this approach, considering the pigeon as an associative machine. The pigeons succeeded in learning these challenging categorization tasks. These tasks were brand new. Nobody had ever studied these with organisms before, although people in AI had used them to see if their models would actually learn, as did ours. So it seems like a simple, basic, single biological mechanism is responsible for the pigeon's learning here. The mechanism is one that is effectively computational and involves only two free parameters: the speed of learning and generalization, how fast learning rises and how much spread there is around a reinforced value in Gabor space. It involves this, it's a three-layer model with one hidden layer. And the basic idea is that it gradually connects distinctive behavioral responses, one of two responses, to stimuli in circumscribed regions of two-dimensional space through error correction. That's it. That's all there is. That's all that's necessary in order to make this work. And therefore, in just a sense, you can consider the pigeon's category learning prowess to be understood as if the bird were an associative machine. But a lingering question remains. What about people? What about people? Well, I told you we didn't dare try the section rings task with people, but we did with the concentric rings task. And here were the data. Once again, these are the same data that you've seen for pigeons. These are the human learning curves over 4 sessions that the subjects got. They didn't have the replica procedure. When they saw a Gabor patch, they just had to press one of 2 keys on the keyboard. And you see that the pigeons and the people both learn. There is some slight advantage to learning in the outer training region than the inner training region, but it's very, very small and is not significant at the end of training. But the more interesting question is, what about those signatures, those unique signatures of associative learning? What about that peak shift effect? So here, once again, was the pigeon's performance. Here was the performance to the 2 training rings. Here was performance in the innermost training area and the outermost, innermost testing area, the outermost testing area. And that's what you saw before. And I'll be darned, the people did the same thing. The people also showed superior performance beyond the outer ring and within the inner ring. They showed the same peak shift as did pigeons. Wow, this was quite a shock. The birds and the people seemed to be doing the same thing, although the theory that was being tested said that the people had an explicit, not only an implicit associative system. Could the theory be wrong, or maybe there's something else we might look at that would more effectively test this hypothesis? So it turns out, for a very long time, I wondered about, is there some method that would effectively get to the point? And it turns out that there is. Matt Brochard and Ellen O'Donoghue, who worked on this project, tried a number of different methods to look at the progress of learning on an individual basis from the beginning of training to mastery of the task. And one of them wound up working really well, and it was a method that Greg Ashby himself and his team created. It's called iterative decision-bound modeling, and effectively what it does is it asks what rules or strategies could be identified by the individual subjects moving through learning trials. And some rules, a rule or a regularity is perhaps a better word for it, is guessing, random guessing. So that's blue. So the pigeons pretty much all start by guessing. And then there's this yellow one represents paying attention, if you will, only to the frequency of the lines, the width of the lines. The orange paying attention to the orientation of the lines. A linear combination of orientation and frequency, and finally a quadratic application or integration, which would be the circular decision space that one would seem to need to do this final task. So let's look at what pigeons did. The pigeons went almost directly from guessing, and then as individuals learned, popped into the final, what they call two-dimensional quadratic rule. It's really the associative mechanism. It's not a rule per se. But the people did something quite strikingly different. You can see that they predominantly used the frequency or width of the lines, less likely that they use the orientation of the lines. But slightly more than half of the subjects, the people, were actually using this very basic idea that you could just carve the space into orientation and frequency. This leverages selective attention to just a single dimension and the application of a simple unidimensional rule. That was exactly what they thought, Ashby and Smith and company thought, separated people and pigeons. So within the same data set, we see evidence on the one hand that makes it look like, for example, pigeons are and people respond in much the same way. They do, but that's only after they've come through the learning process, which seems to have been different for pigeons and people. So where are we? Well, it's the case that pigeons and college students learned the concentric rings task. They both showed very similar stimulus generalization performance. A slim majority of the students, the undergraduates, deployed unidimensional rules en route to learning, but no pigeons did so. And these data indeed suggest that humans seem to have both or deploy both implicit and explicit categorization systems, but our poor pigeons have only the implicit system. But we shouldn't be too sad for them, since they are able to master these tasks and maybe some tasks that people would fail at. Well, let's go to another question. I've talked about these Gabor stimuli, but they're not very lifelike. These are, right? These are stimuli you've never seen before, but you can categorize them with great ease. We do this all the time. These kinds of basic level categories are quite familiar to us, but they're much more complicated than these Gabor patches. What are we going to do with these stimuli? We're not going to be able to analyze these in terms of two simple dimensions. Their complexity just militates against that. And given that complexity, can an associative model actually deal with stimuli of this richness and complexity? Well, I'm going to tell you that it can, and that was the result of work that I had done many years earlier with Fabian Soto. We developed a model, an associative model that incorporated Este's well-known stimulus sampling theory. And that was the critical feature that allowed us to deal with not these very unnatural Gabor stimuli with more natural photographic stimuli. So how does this model work? It's pretty simple. You see a pigeon, right? And the pigeon is looking at a stimulus. It sees the blue car, and the model hypothesizes that a collection of stimuli are activated somewhere in the pigeon's brain. It sees another stimulus, a red car, and you see another region, an somewhat overlapping but somewhat distinctive region is activated. A yellow car, getting the picture? So you see that there's some area of overlap among the three stimuli, some area of distinctiveness. Those areas that are stimulus specific render them unlike the other members of the category. But some elements are common to all three of these cars. And so you hypothesize there to be both stimulus-specific and category-specific stimuli. You integrate that into an associative rule, and what happens? Well, I'll show you what happens in just a second. The setup is not so different from what you'd seen before. The pigeon, in this particular case, has a viewing screen. It sees a picture, And after it pecks this picture any number of times, it might be 10, it might be 20, it might be 30 for different birds. It then has 4 buttons that come on. 4, not 2, because we've shown the pigeon 4 different categories. One button is going to be the correct one to report members of one category, in this case, the flower button, and there would be the other 3 buttons would be associated with the different kinds of stimuli. And in a session, the pigeon would see various numbers of flowers, cars, chairs, and cats. Okay? So this is from the bird's eye view. There's one stimulus that's associated, one response that's associated with one category, and these categories are different for different pigeons. So the pigeon pecks any number of times, just to rehearse this. When the viewing screen shows a stimulus, it then sees all 4 buttons. It has to make a response. The first response is unlikely to be correct. By chance, it'll be 25% likely to be correct. The pigeon, if it pecks it, gets food. If it doesn't peck it, the choice buttons go off. The pigeon has to make the observing response one more time. It completes the observing response. The 4 buttons come on again. And if now it corrects its mistake, it then gets reinforcement. What happens when you do the experiment? Yeah, I'm going to not only show you the predictions of the model to make it a little simpler for you. And what you see is, of course, they learn. That's not a surprise. And when you show brand new stimuli for the first time, you get transfer. It may be lower than it was at to the training stimuli, but that's to be expected because the stimuli that you're showing, although they have some elements in common to the other training stimuli, they're unique. And to the extent that they're unique, they're different. And to the extent that they're different, you'll get a lower level of responding. So this is a classic finding with people, with pigeons, with all God's creatures that have been tested in categorization experiments. That's what happens. So you both get learning and you get transfer, but with some decrement in responding. But that decrement in responding is lawful, as is the speed of learning. So here's an experiment. This was part of Ramesh Bhatt's dissertation. Some pigeons were trained with 12 members of the category, of each of the 4 categories. And you see this is the predicted speed of learning. Some pigeons were trained with 4 exemplars per category, not as many. And some pigeons, they were trained with only 1 example per category. Wow, were they ever fast to learn? They're terrific, right? Well, now you test the birds. Now you show the birds that had been given just 1 example of cats, cars, chairs, and flowers. Though they were really doing well, but not when you show them brand new stimuli. They're terrible. They have no ability to transfer whatsoever because you haven't built up enough of a base of of exemplars so that a novel stimulus resembles one of the training stimuli. And as you increase the number of stimuli that you've given in training, the number of different exemplars, you see better and better transfer. The graph that I showed you before, this involved 10 examples per category, and it looks pretty much like what you expect to see when you have 12. So the model is doing just what it's supposed to do. It's building representations of categories as a result of exemplar training. It is, of course, to those of you who are familiar with the lingo, an exemplar model, but the generalization function enables it to respond to new stimuli nonetheless. Here's another experiment. In this experiment, we trained pigeons on odd-numbered days with the same stimuli. So we had, let's say, 10 cats, 10 cars, chairs, flowers, 10, right? And they're repeating. They're the same ones day after day after day, on odd-numbered days. On even-numbered days, they get brand new stimuli they've never seen before. So these days are effectively testing days with brand new stimuli. And you can see that the level of accuracy that the birds attain is really high with repeating stimuli, not so much with stimuli that don't repeat. So it's another way that you can see the effect of repetition. You don't need, the birds can learn. Another independent group were trained with just non-repeating slides, and they learned they didn't have to have these interpolated repeating stimuli. They learned on a unique trial basis. And well, that's the result of transfer from old examples to new ones. So repetition helps, but you don't need repetition at all to learn. And now the last experiment I'll share with you is a kind of a funky one, but it proves an important point. In the experiments that I've described to you, when you have 4 different categories, 1, 2, 3, and 4, like cats and flowers and chairs and cars, whatever they might happen to be, all the examples came from the same category. But you can create pseudo-categories. What are pseudo-categories? Pseudo-categories have an equal number of cats, for example, in one category, and flowers, and chairs, and cars. And that's true of all 4 pseudo-categories. So pseudo-category 1, 2, 3, and 4 are going to be hard to learn. They're going to be hard to learn because there's going to be an equal number of what we call 4 basic level categories in this pseudo category. So a pseudo category would require a peck to the upper left-hand key for all of these stimuli, like cat 1, cat 2, cat 3, flower 1, flower 2, flower 3, chair 1, chair 2, chair 3, car 1, car 2, car 3, and so forth. This is a great null hypothesis experiment. What this experiment is telling us, or is effectively asking, is, are the pigeons simply learning individual stimulus-response associations? Or is there some still element of generalization involved? Is it really important that the members of a category resemble one another? And the answer is, it really matters. If the stimuli are all from the basic level categories, cats and cars and chairs and flowers, the birds learn just fine. The model says this, the pigeons say this. The pseudo category, well, it starts around 25% as well, and ultimately gets, in real life with pigeons, about 44% correct. They actually can learn this, but it's by this brute memorization mechanism, and they'll never catch up in this case, in all likelihood. So overall, the pigeon's striking success in learning to categorize a wide range of both naturalistic and artificial stimuli in several different training tasks appears to be based on a simple biological mechanism. This associative learning mechanism gradually links distinctive behavioral responses to limited regions of multidimensional perceptual space via an error correction process. In the case of the Gabor stimuli, there were only 2 dimensions that needed to be modeled. In the case of naturalistic stimuli, there are many dimensions, and we can't necessarily tell you how many there are. I mean, how many are involved in discriminating cats and cars and chairs and flowers? Who knows? But plenty. The pigeon's category learning ability can thus be understood as if the pigeon were an associative machine. But of course, the pigeon isn't a human-made machine, it's a nature-made machine. And understanding the many intricacies of the biological mechanisms of that natural system will require the deployment of advanced neurobiological mechanisms, which is just where we're headed when we go back to Germany to owner Günterken's lab to pursue some of these ideas. So thanks very much for all of you for your attention.